love, love, love till I hear the breath of the Spirit flowing in me.
Hello, welcome to Spirit of Life. I'm David McLauchlan, and my guest this week is Tommy Kenning, a sacred artist from Scotland. Hello, Tommy.
Thanks, David. Thank you for having me on the show.
Have you always been interested in art? Was it something you wanted to get into when you were young?
Yeah, since I was any age, since I was a young child, I was always drawing, and it was always something I had a keen interest in since early years, since I was a boy. So that and playing football, or soccer as we would say in Europe. So those were the two things that I was always doing since I was a young boy, and always had a great passion and love for it. So it's kind of stuck with me, I guess.
What were some of your early influences in art?
Well, just as a typical young kid, growing up in the 70s, you know, the science fiction things like Star Wars and, you know, comic books and Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, all of that whole genre, science fiction and fantasy. That was, you know, I always had a very fertile imagination, so these things were great source of interest to me as a young boy growing up, and had a big influence on my early childhood, you know, through into teenage years, where that's when I began to think I would seriously consider becoming a comic book artist at that time, and had great desire to do that in my young teenage years, and just constantly was drawing all the time, and that was the life for me back then.
What were some of your big influences in the comic book field?
Many artists from a range of, like Brian Boland, Dave Gibbons, you know, the works of Alan Moore. A lot of these names are household names, are well-known names in the comic book world. Just many of the UK artists were breaking through into America at that time, and were kind of revolutionising the comic book industry, as well as some of the other artists and writers like Frank Miller. And some of these guys are very, very well known, very famous today, even with movies and things like that. So these were the kind of interests, the influences that had a big impact on my early art interests in the teenage years, as I would say.
Looking at your work, we have some on the set behind us here, and particularly some other images I've seen. There's one on your DVD of the Pope standing on a cliff and looking towards a building. It's very reminiscent of the sort of sci fantasy arts like Boris Vallejo and.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think probably subconsciously a lot of these influences, you know, all go into the mix, and your own ideas and art. All these things play a part in ways in which to make subjects, theological concepts, interesting, and maybe abstract concepts more interesting and concrete, especially for younger people, because sometimes to talk theology or philosophy may be a bit hard and difficult to understand some of the more, you know, difficult concepts. But when you bring it down to the level of imagery, I know it's maybe a cliche, but you know, a picture speaks 1,000 words, and an image can say so much more than any amount of words can do sometimes, and can convey a message which can touch the person at a deeper level, maybe even consciously or subconsciously, and you know, create a response. So all those things definitely have always stayed with me. I don't think when you progress in art you lose what you've gained. It's just like, you know, learning your times tables as a child, and then you go into more complicated equations, you know, in maths as you get older. It's the same in art. You have all the basic early things that have stayed with me throughout my whole artistic career, if you like.
So those comic book and sci fantasy type influences, do you think that has helped your art in a religious context be more relevant to today's young people?
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe not consciously, but I think subconsciously I've tried to create a bridge between the modern and the old, taking some of the best of what's been done in traditional art, you know, down the centuries, and also with modern techniques and ideas of conveying images that really create a dynamic and exciting, panorama whether it be in a portrait or whether it be in a scene depicting matters of the faith. I think it just gives it a whole new life, that gives it a fresh life maybe, that to do it in the same traditional way may not have had the same appeal, because so many people are conscious of many of the old masters, and they maybe get, through repetition, have become desensitised to it. So I think creating a new, maybe modern way, but still respectful of the traditions and classical concepts of imagery of the Trinity, God the Father, Jesus, things like that people are familiar with today.
Talking about classical artists and traditional artists, who are some of your influences of that sort of area?
Well, you're going back to the Renaissance period of, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, right through to, people like Caravaggio, and many of the artists whom are famous, world famous, Rembrandt, Mantegna, many of them who created some of the most outstanding pieces of religious art down the centuries. All of these played a big part in forming me as an artist, to strive for a level of excellence, because I think these things demand it, first of all, but also it gives you a standard to aim for, because it's so good. And bearing in mind these were created centuries ago, and the level of excellence is the standard, the benchmark by which I think every artist tries to measure themselves against, even many secular artists. And I know even in the comic book world itself, I've read interviews with many of them, and they refer to some of these artists as being a powerful influence on their own art even to this day. So it still remains relevant, even in secular art in the movies as well.
On that note, we have to take a short break.
Thanks.
You're watching Spirit of Life. We'll be back in a moment.